welcome to our session. We're very excited to be here with all of you today. And so just to get us started, I wanted to give a brief intro to who we are and what conservation optimism is all about, in case you haven't heard of us before. So we're a movement that aims to achieve improved trends for species and ecosystem worldwide. And one aspect of achieving this mission is that we are ensuring that stories that generate optimism get amplified and heard. And so if you have headlines that are usually unavoidably grim, then at least they're not told without an action step. So for us, that's something that's really important. And we do that so that everyone can feel empowered to act for nature instead of being left feeling depressed and powerless. And so we really want to foster an online community of conservation optimists. And you can see in the poll that we've asked you if you feel like you're one, so please let us know. And so what we're going to do on this roundtable today is share with you what makes various team members optimistic and how we are all using our optimism as a tool to empower people to act for nature. And just for you to know, we have pre-recorded our session because we are quite a lot of, it was quite a big panel. So in terms of tech, we prefer to just avoid any kind of glitches and pre-recorded. But that means that we'll be able to answer your questions in the chat, that we'll be able to interact and send you links. So, you know, you'll be gaining as well in this. So I'm Julia, the program manager of Conservation Optimism, and I'm now going to quickly introduce our wonderful panelists. So to start with, we have Nina. Nina does a lot of Conservation Optimism social media, and she is here. She'll wave at you. She's also the communication officer for Synchronicity Earth, and that's one of our founding partners and a member of our Conservation Now network. Next, we have Sofia. So Sofia manages the creative communication for Conservation Optimism, and she is my co-host on our Good Nature podcast, and she also does a lot for the film festival. And at the same time, she's also finished a PhD in marine conservation, so she is very busy at the moment. And next, we have Trisha. Trisha is part of the India Hub of Conservation Optimism, which started earlier this year. And she's also a marine conservationist who will be starting a PhD at Oxford soon. Next, we have also Cheri. Cheri is our director, and she also works at Synchronicity Earth, so our founding partner. And last but not least, we have Megan from Key Conservation. So Megan is a wildlife biologist who started her own tech app. And so here she is. And so what we're going to do before starting the session is we are going to play a little video to tell you a bit more about what Key Conservation is all about. And then we will play the video of the panel. So now we're just going to play the pre-recorded video as well so that you can see the session. And if you have any questions, please put them on the chat. We'll be answering them as we go. To kickstart the conversation this afternoon with all of you, I wanted to ask you what drives you to be optimistic. And I was wondering if Trisha, you might want to get us started.
Thank you, Julia, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Trisha, and I'm really excited to be here at the Communicate conference. So what makes me optimistic about conservation? So working in the conservation space in India can be pretty challenging sometimes because we kind of face a lot of complexities when it comes to balancing wildlife conservation with all of the needs of literally 1 billion people in the country. So if it can be pretty depressing if we only focus on the challenges and the complexities of it all. So I learned pretty early on in my career that it's really important to look at the bright side and look at the positives and all the things that are going well instead. And at the same time, I've also been lucky to have worked with and interacted with a lot of really passionate young people in this field who are really enthusiastic about conservation and wildlife and the environment. So I think that's also made me a bit hopeful and made me feel like I'm a part of this larger network or community of conservationists, both in India and also across the world in general. So I think thanks to all of these things, I can say that I'm a bit of a conservation optimist. And I think that's something that Megan can also relate to a bit. So maybe she can tell us about that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Trisha. One of the reasons I feel optimistic is definitely because of the people I talk to in the field. At Key Conservation, we connect individuals with real-time actionable steps they can take to fill gaps in funding and support for conservation organizations. So because of this, I've been really lucky to be able to speak with conservationists who are working all over the world with all types of species. And I'm constantly inspired by their unrelenting drive to do whatever they can day after day to keep species from going extinct. But on the other hand, I've spoken with countless individuals who are not directly involved with conservation, who are ready to do more. So like give the professional skills to make a difference and stuff like that. So it's this willingness for collaboration with people from all areas and professions, coupled with all the new technology that's coming out and the transparency we're able to give people of what's happening in the field in real time, that really makes me optimistic. So I think this kind of collaboration between different areas is something that maybe Cheri can expand on a little bit for us here.
Yeah, thanks. So building relationships with people and building collaborations is something that has been at the heart of conservation optimism since we started actually started as the media support for a one-off conference, and then it became this longer running movement and now organization. And you know, it's not about necessarily just these success stories, but part of what gives me optimism is looking at that kind of bigger picture of, it doesn't mean everything is okay. I think the technical definition of optimism is a blend of hopefulness and confidence, and having confidence that if we work together, things can get better, even if they're not okay now, and even if there's not, you know, a 100% you know, certainty of things being a certain level of better in the future. You can look around the world and you see these stories that are coming out, small local stories that are highlighting the power that individuals have to make a difference for nature. And I think that's been one of the things this year. You know, obviously 2020 has been a horrible year in many ways, and there's been a lot of extra negativity floating around. But we have seen the power of what can happen with our planet when people stop doing as much, you know, and we give the planet a break. But you see these incredible stories of recovery from around the world in various places. And it's not just in 2020, you know, so these individual stories, these replicable successes and these action points where things may be grim, but there are people who are striving to make a difference, I think is something that gives me a lot of optimism. And, you know, I think Sofia, actually, you can talk about telling stories in a creative way.
Yeah, thanks, Cheri. I think that during my time Conservation Optimism, working on the podcast and then also working on the film festival, there's definitely been a sort of sense of collective action, which has been really strong, and just kind of like having this shared experience of people and why they care about nature, why they feel optimistic, and kind of like the way that they frame their narratives is really inspiring. I mean, for me personally, I think that my sort of love for nature ever since I was fairly young is really important to keeping me going, and in particular because I think that I am not really a traditional optimist. I have in the past been called a Debbie Downer around certain aspects. And yeah, I mean, in general, I think that it is really important to acknowledge the difficulty of what is going on in conservation, right? And the fact that it's not totally rosy. And so kind of like my form of optimism is not necessarily just being like, oh, everything's great, but actually kind of like there is some level of catharsis in involving an understanding of things that may be frustrating us or like are difficult for us, because there are people who are making a difference, right? And we can see that and we can all work together. And I personally find that very inspiring, and I find that it really helps to keep me optimistic.
Yeah, so I get that as well, Sophia, that idea of not being a traditional optimist. I don't know, I think I keep a lid on it. I'm not sure people would describe me as a pessimist, but I definitely feel that way a lot if I let myself open the door to think about the big problems and how big they are. And you know, I think that's something that we deal with quite a lot when people talk to us maybe for the first time, where they say, well, you know, how can you be optimistic? You know, the problems are so big. And they almost kind of imply that you're being stupid for being optimistic. It's just so idealistic. Your just heads are in the clouds or whatever. And I think, you know, I've dealt with those kind of comments a lot in my career, as well as in my own head. And I think that if it's not so much that optimism is a choice, but it's something that we need, because if you don't have it, you do not feel motivated to work in this sector, to try and strive for change. And I think it's so important, because without optimism, you have no motivation. There's a colleague of mine who wrote a beautiful blog last year about conservation optimism, and what she said was, you cannot build what you cannot imagine. And I just thought that was, I've read it and I just, like, it really struck a chord with me, because if we aren't optimistic, what are we heading towards? You know, what are we aiming for? Like, if we can't imagine that takes optimism. You have to have optimism to aim for the future that you want. So that's really important to me.
Yeah, that's something that resonates with me as well quite a lot, because I think I came back to optimism a few years ago after doing my journalism degree, and basically it was the time of Brexit, the time of the Trump election. There was a lot going on that year. And I remember thinking, you know, I wanted to create this journalism platform, but I wanted it to be really optimistic and really solution-based and positive. And that's how I found out that actually there was a movement in journalism as well called the Solutions Journalism Network that was pushing for more solution-based reporting. And so funnily enough, that's kind of what brought me back to the optimism and more solution-driven story before I actually started my job at Conservation Optimism. So then it somehow all connected really nicely. But I agree, like for me, if we don't have optimism, then, you know, I can't get up in the morning if I don't have that hope that things can improve, because otherwise it's like, well, why do I keep going if I think that things can't improve? So for me, the optimism is really the drive that makes me act to empower people to act for nature. And so now that we've all shared what makes us optimistic, I'm actually really keen to hear a bit more about all of you on the panel, and to know how you use that optimism as a drive, as a tool to empower people. And I was wondering, Cheri, if you could get us started on how you're actually turning your optimism into action as part of your role as the director of Conservation Optimism.
Hi, yeah. My connection must be silted a little bit, but I think I caught the end of your question, which was about how am I turning optimism into action? And I think, you know, me personally, something that I have a tendency to do this year in particular, I know I've mentioned that previously about 2020 being an unusual circumstance, but getting caught up in doom scrolling and kind of fixating on some of the really troubling and anxiety inducing headlines around the world, whether they're conservation focused or not. But actually trying to instead focus on who is helping with these issues and where you can plug in. And that's part of what conservation optimism is really trying to facilitate, is shining a spotlight on the action steps and the heroes and the people who are making a difference around the world. And for me, finding out where then I can plug in, if that's something I can do directly, or since we're all, in lockdown, most of us around the world where we are, whether that is something that can be done online. And Megan, I think maybe this would be a great place for you to talk about, because key conservation is something that I'm really excited about as a tool for people being able to use their skills and use their various ways of getting involved in action for conservation.
Yes, definitely. I think the main thing I want to drive home is that you don't have to be in conservation to be a conservationist. And right now, we're in an all hands on deck situation when it comes to our planet. And I think the fact is that we've barely scratched the surface of the resources, the knowledge, and the skills that we could be tapping in to address many of these issues. And that's why I'm excited about what we're working on at Key Conservation. We're creating ways for people to give, and how they can use their skills is a huge part of that. So no matter where you are or what you're doing, or based, you can help conservation. So imagine like you're reading an article about a problem a conservation organization is facing, and instead of saying, "Oh, that's terrible," or "you could do something about it," and then just moving on to the next article, which a lot of us do, because what can we do about it, right? Instead, we'd have a direct link to this organization in the field and be able to see what they're doing in real time and have actionable steps to be able to make a difference, from giving funds to giving your skills to helping in person, and then being able to get updates about how your support made a difference. So that's what we're building at Key Conservation. And so I'm excited because soon when you read stories on the Conservation Optimism website, you'll be able to do just that. You'll be able to go from being a reader of a story to actually taking action and becoming a character in the story and changing the outcome of how that story becomes written. So I think that there's so many opportunities for us to be able to do that, and I'm looking forward to making that happen through Key Conservation.
Super exciting just to see kind of like the ways that conservation optimism is bringing all this stuff together. I completely agree with your point of not having to be kind of like in traditional conservation to be a conservationist. I think that one thing that's been really important to me and Julia in sort of pushing forward the podcast and the film festival is just the idea of talking to lots of different kinds of people who would not necessarily be considered conservationists, kind of like from the off, or like from the starting point or whatever. In terms of, on the podcast we've spoken to psychotherapists, we spoke to this really cool theatre director whose show I watched at Edinburgh, and then we've also talked to more kind of like traditional field conservationists. And for me personally, when I was like, oh, we should do a podcast, I thought, what a great idea. This is such a good excuse for me to be able to get an hour of time with all these people who I think are really interesting. But also obviously, hopefully our listeners think they're interesting as well. But I think it's really helped me to understand all of these different aspects of conservation, the ways that people can be pushing conservation forward in their own fields where traditional conservationists aren't, right? And so it's really important to have those voices and those different ways of pushing forward this care about the environment. And then also I think another really important thing is just a wide perception of what a conservationist is. And that can hopefully empower all sorts of people to be thinking about conservation and optimism in their daily lives and the things that they can do. And I feel very lucky to have a very wonderful co-host on the podcast and co-organizer for the film festival in Julia.
What a smooth transition, Sofia. We're so used to do them for the podcast.
I think one thing that I really enjoy as well about the podcast, and that's one thing that is at the core of the mission of Conservation Optimism, is really that we are trying to amplify voices of people that might not be heard otherwise. And so, as Sofia said, it gets us to talk to lots of different people, which is really exciting. And the way we do that as well is we are always trying to reach different audiences with the content that we developed. So, you know, be it we might develop our communication toolkit because our members have said that they need help to frame their communication. Or we might as well do posters that are specifically for kids, and these are like, you know, easy chunk of information, big characters. We may do animated videos. There's just so many different ways that we can bring all these different stories to different audiences, and that's something that I am personally always really thrilled to work on, because it means every day is different, and then you get to reach all these different audiences as well in slightly different ways. And I think that really link as well with our network overall, so Conservation Now, that I've mentioned earlier. It's really this idea that at the moment we have now about 105 members, and so that's quite amazing, because we started about, you know, a few years ago, and it really grew because people have this drive that they want to have more optimism, and they want some help in the way they can frame these stories to be a bit more optimistic, because sometimes it's easy to say, oh, we just want it to be, you know, a bit more solution driven, but then it's like, okay, how do you actually make your story more solutions based? And that's something that we're really developing with the members, trying to put them in touch with each other. We have members who are working in like the film industry. We have people who are more traditional conservationists. It's really this range of different expertise that we're also hoping can then get in touch with each other and help support each other as well. So it's another aspect of the work that we do at Conservation Optimism that is really important to us.
If you don't mind, I'll just jump in as a representative of a Conservation Now member. So I have previously worked for Conservation Optimism, and still, like, they can't kick me off the team. But my primary job is with Synchronicity Earth, which is part of the Conservation Now network, but are also one of the founding partners. So we have that network, and we use that network, but we also have quite a deep relationship with Conservation Optimism, fortunately, because I love Conservation Optimism. Take any excuse to work with them. I'm not just saying that, it genuinely makes me really happy doing this stuff, which is another bonus of doing optimistic work. But yeah, I thought I'd use an example of when I used this at work recently. So I'm a communications and engagement officer, and I was trying to write about freshwater conservation recently, because there had been a couple of quite important reports, the Living Planet Index from WWF and ZSL, and the World Migratory Fish Index, I think the report's called. And they're both quite important, a lot of research all about freshwater biodiversity in the state that it's in. And as it's one of our specialities, I wanted to, you know, highlight this for our audience and our donors, but it was incredibly depressing, and I kept putting it off. You know, like, it was my own deadline. I was like, I need to write about this, but, you know, like, weeks passed and I couldn't plug in, because every time I opened it, it's super depressing. You know, I think one of the stats, something like 90% of the world's wetlands have gone, you know, since the 1700s. It's, you know, really, really depressing things. And you get to a point where you realize that if you don't want to write it, no one's going to want to read it. Like, if you don't even have enough motivation to write it, you know, your readers aren't going to have that motivation either. And eventually I was just like, well, let's use some of this training with Conservation Optimism, and I'll reframe it that way. And I'm not going to lie, it was hard, because, you know, freshwater isn't doing great. That's why we specialize in it. And, you know, it took a lot of looking, but once I did find those stories, and also just finding ways to frame the bad news as well is quite important. And these were skills that we developed when we did a workshop. So Conservation Optimism hosted a workshop for framing, positive framing. And the results of that workshop are now a guide, so you can look at it and sort of take those key messages and how to write in a more optimistic way, in a way that doesn't emphasize the bad things that are going on. And so that was really helpful. And what I ended up finding was some really, really positive little stories to amplify. There's one that I'm just going to share with you that, and maybe you know this, maybe you didn't, I didn't know this, but the Eurasian beaver, so, you know, like intercontinental charismatic mammal, in the 12th century, there was only 1,200 individuals left in the wild. You know, like if that was today, you know, that would be an endangered or critically endangered species. And today there's more than 1 million in the wild. Like, that's a huge change. And, you know, there are various things, you can read my blog to find out what contributed to it. It's not a silver bullet, it's never a silver bullet, but it's those kind of stories are what keep you motivated. They're the things that people want to read about. Maybe you want to read my blog now, even though there's a lot of other things in there about the reports that catch you with that hook. And that's, you know, a lot of what I do is on social media. I've done social media with Conservation Optimism and Synchronicity Earth. And something that I really enjoy doing is looking at the Conservation Optimism hashtag. And one of the things, so when we were developing the Conservation Optimism Instagram, we wanted to look at, so people and organizations will use that hashtag to share stories like that beaver story. And so you scroll it and it's the opposite of doom scrolling, you know, happy scrolling. And those are the stories that we started putting in a roundup. We did it on our Instagram story. It did really well. So we then now have just a blog that will do a Twitter and Instagram roundup of these stories, amplifying what organizations are already talking about. So those stories that maybe otherwise wouldn't get that kind of audience, which is something that I really enjoy. And then, like, one more thing that we've done on social media is we started doing a quiz as well, which started as quite a silly thing. It's got like weird animal names and fascinating facts, but like, again, just kind of used it as a hook to get people for the last part of the quiz, which is always conservation optimism based. So we hook you in and then like sell you our big idea. And usually I let you in on a secret because I don't think we've told our audience this at all, but they'll be based on the stories we shared at the beginning of the week. So if you're paying attention, then you'll know. And what's really fun is sometimes it's multiple choice and people will go for the most depressing answers, like what's the percentage of the bycatch has been reduced in South Africa? And it was 98%, and no one clicked 98%. They all went with the lowest number that I put there, and that was awesome. I really like that feeling of everyone getting it wrong. But yeah, I think that Instagram and social media are really powerful tools for doing that, and I think Trisha can talk about that because she's just started doing the Conservation Optimism India hub on Instagram.
Yeah, so yes, social media has been a really, really important tool for us at the India Hub. So just to tell you a bit more of this India Hub, it's a pretty recent thing started by a group of us who were really inspired by the whole conservation optimism movement globally, and many of us also attended this conservation optimism conference that was held at Oxford last year, and we were just thinking, yeah, we have to bring this to our country. So that's what we did. And right now we're using social media to conservation optimists. I'm sorry, I think I lost network for a second. But yeah, we're using social media to build a platform of conservation optimists and a community in the country. So we want our social media to do a number of different things. One is that we're using it as a bit of a storytelling platform. So we've started the series called Humans of Conservation, which is kind of based on the Humans of New York movement. And well, what we really believe is that conservation is not just about saving a species or saving nature, but it's also about all the different people who are actively involved in this and who've dedicated their lives to work in the space. So we wanted to sort of throw a spotlight on them, on all of these people, and give them a chance to tell their stories. So this series has actually been really successful and popular because we've had a number of people reach out to us from all kinds of different backgrounds from all parts of the country who just want to tell us about their story and their experiences working in conservation. And this also includes people really working at the very grassroots level to engage in conservation. So it's actually been really amazing just for us as well to hear from all of these different people and hear their stories and be able to tell them and just learn so much ourselves about the different things that are happening in the country in the space. And another thing that we're doing is we also want to be a bit of a mobilizing platform. So unfortunately, right now, our country is sort of facing a lot of environmental and conservation issues because especially in the COVID-19 lockdowns, there have been a number of infrastructure development projects that have received clearance and approval without proper environmental impact assessments. And obviously, this is not a very good thing. So there's been quite a lot of movement, and quite a lot of people have come together to raise their voices against all of these projects. And our social media platforms have also been engaged in this. But rather than focus on sort of the negatives or the more doom and gloom aspects of these issues, we kind of want to be a bit of a call to action and show people why there is still hope in these situations and what they can do to kind of get involved, to get engaged in a more productive way and actually be involved in these issues. So that's something that we've been really passionate about and actively being engaged with. So yeah, if you want to know more about the kind of work we do, or if you want to contribute, you can follow us on Instagram or on Twitter. So we're called Conservation Optimism India.
And I have to say, it's been so incredible seeing how much the Hub has already accomplished in such a short amount of time, because I mean, we started the Hub only a few months ago, so it's been incredible seeing all the things that you've already been doing. So hopefully we've given you all a good flavor of what conservation optimism is all about and the type of things that we do. But before answering your questions, I just wanted to ask one more thing to all our panelists. And this is going to be like a quick round, so it will be very brief answers. But could everyone just give me the top tip that you've learned working with conservation optimism?
I was trying to unmute myself. Yeah, so I mean, the top thing that I have learned from working with conservation optimism over the last few years is to speak out and seek your community. There are other people that feel the same. There are other people that really need to hear what you're doing. There are people that need to connect with you, that there's people that you need to connect with. And so the community that we've gathered around conservation optimism is something that keeps me going. And I think that it's, you know, if conservation optimism is the community that you seek, welcome, the more the merrier. But additionally, outside of the conservation sector, I think that it translates to other things, and to seek out and connect with people, because together we can do a lot more than we can do individually.
I think that's a great tip. I think that my thing is probably that, and this is something that I've loved doing for a while, but I think that telling stories in a creative way is really empowering, and it can help you to even clarify what's important to you in what you care about nature, or in the experiences that you have had. And it can also really help you to connect with other people. And there are lots of ways to do that, even in lockdown, right? I mean, obviously, Julia and I started a podcast, but I mean, there are so many things to do. Like, animation is very close to my heart. I have done that previously, and I love it when we get animation submissions to the film festival, because that can be like so varied, and you really don't need that many materials to make a good animation. And small plug, we will be having a 2021 film festival for conservation optimism. So if you've got an idea, just, you know, like, start working on it, start getting it together. And Julia and I will really look forward to seeing any submissions that you have.
Yeah, I just like to build off that, because you know, it's like what you're passionate about, like tap into that. I think that people think they have to be in a certain box, and I think we're seeing now more than ever that whatever you do for a living, or it's your passion, you can use it for conservation. So I would just like to tack on to that as well, that you can be from anywhere. You know, you don't have to be in a place that has a lot of conservation going. You can reach out and connect with people, and that's, I guess, what I'd like to plug Key Conservation for, because we're looking to connect people with organizations around the world with their passion and how they can use that. So hopefully you'll join us, so signing up at keyconservation.org. But yeah, make sure that you don't limit yourself to different boxes, but use your passion for good. So.
Yeah, so just again, building on what you're saying about community and working together, you know, I think it's something that both Conservation Optimism and Synchronicity do a lot. I haven't worked in organizations that are that collaborative before, and it's amazing like what you can get done, especially there's like a diversity of thought between different people on different teams, and you can reach ideas and projects that you couldn't have thought of before. I mean, you know, like I've not worked with someone in conservation tech before, and obviously that's what Megan specializes in, and she's, you know, like creating a new field, and it's really exciting to hear her talking about it. And one of the things that Conservation Optimism is doing is actively connecting these organizations with conservation now. As Julia mentioned earlier, we're currently celebrating the fact that we reached 100 members. We'll probably still be featuring them when this airs. So if you go on our social media, you'll see them everywhere. And that's really wonderful. We're able to now showcase them so people can see who's in the network if they aren't already engaged. And so if you are working for an organization that, as we've mentioned, doesn't have to be strictly conservation focused, but you think that you could add to the community, you want to be connected to it, then speak to your organization and see if they want to be part of it. You know, there are benefits, as well as like having your stories amplified and reaching the members of the network. There are so many resources that Conservation Optimism has been building. I mean, some of them are on the website, you can access them now. I talked about the positive communication toolkit, which you can see on the resources section. But you know, we're working on other projects as well. So it is really worth it if you want to develop these skills of reframing, you know, good stories, but also, you know, the harder stories to communicate in a positive way that's going to inspire people to take action, because I think it's really important.
So for me, I think one thing that Conservation Optimism has really taught me is that, as I kind of mentioned earlier, it's really important to focus on the positives and look at the bright side rather than the negatives, because especially when you're working in the space, there could be 100 things that go wrong in a day, or 100 reasons to feel depressed, or feel that, you know, you can never find a solution to this problem. So what has helped me in the last few years is to really reflect back every day and think of the things that went right, even if it could be something really tiny, like having one fisherman who is actually listening to the things that I say and is interested about my work. That for me counts as a little victory. And it's important to just think about these small positives and sort of build them up, build more momentum on them, share them out to the rest of the conservation community, because that can also inspire other people to focus on their positives. And yeah, I think that really helps in the whole conservation optimism movement.
Yes, and I guess my own tip would be, and it's one that I've not been good at doing this past week for the news overall, but to avoid the doom scrolling is to kind of try to curate your social media. So I think with conservation, for example, if all the people you're following on Twitter or Instagram are all sharing, you know, the doom and gloom and all about the extinction and what is failing, then you can feel just this heavy sense of, oh my god, nothing is working. So I think just making sure that you balance it out by following people who have a bit more optimistic outlook is also really important. And so, you know, obviously you can follow us, you can follow the India Hub, you can follow all our Conservation Now members. Just make sure to balance your media diets as well, I think is really important. And so I think that's going to be it for today, but I wanted to say thank you to all the amazing panelists for joining today. And we are now going to answer your questions. So thank you all for watching.
Seems like we've got some great questions coming in. I think we'll just wait a second to see if Julia can come back, since she's moderating the session.
Or in her absence. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, while we're waiting for Julia to join, I was just wondering if any of you could answer the questions you need to be an organisation to join Conservation Optimism, or is there an individual type membership?
So currently we have the Conservation Now, the Conservation Network of Optimists Worldwide, which is an organizational network. If you want to get plugged in as an individual, obviously please join the conversation on Twitter. We've got a Facebook group that is just undergoing a bit of a revival. We've got a couple of new people on our social media team, so that's very exciting. We've also got communities around our Instagram and on LinkedIn, and so individuals are more encouraged to plug in through our social channels and organizations through the Conservation Now. Welcome back, Julia. I'm going to let you take it. Stu had just thrown a question our way, so I answered it in your absence.
Yeah, no, perfect. I think hopping is just it seems to decide that once I've muted myself once, it's muted forever, but I'm back. I saw on the chat that someone asked us an interesting question. So I'm going to pass that on to the panel. What are your tips for dealing with the negative people we come across who thinks that there's no hope? How did you deal with that? Megan, do you want to go first? Maybe I'm thinking like with the app and everything you do is kind of connected.
Yeah, I think it's about taking small steps, like having actual steps that you can take to make a difference is a big deal. So, you know, just choosing one step so you can make forward is a big deal, I think would help. But engaging through key conservation is going to be helpful because we're going to be able to show people how they can take action and do something and see the outcome of what they've been able to achieve. So, you know, reaching out to local organizations so you can get out there in the field is a big one because you can actually see how you're making a difference in real time. And I think that helps kind of get keeps it going, and then you can kind of build from there. And then tapping into your skills that you have. I feel like sometimes the problem is some people feel like they're not making a difference. They can't see how they're making a difference. And so being able to actually use the skill set that you have that someone else really needs is something that's really powerful. So you can feel like you're doing something more than just giving 25 pounds or whatever, and then kind of wondering how you made a difference. So I think engaging in those ways would be really helpful, and I think that's what we're trying to achieve through the conservation platform. So yeah, that's where I'd start.
Go on, Sophia.
So if I could just add my 2 cents on this, I guess that when I think of this, I think that there's a difference between people who are in despair and people who don't want to engage. And I think that something that made me reflect on this was that one of our podcast episodes was with a psychologist who focuses on eco-anxiety. And she was talking about how it's really important not to kind of like squash your despair or your negative feelings, because actually that can end up being worse in the long run, right? So I think that sometimes it's really important to validate those feelings and just to say, yeah, like I totally get it, right? Like things are looking a bit grim, but then also maybe having some examples of things that are working, or that for things that you can do, as Megan was saying, because otherwise I think that just trying to kind of like stifle those negative impulses doesn't necessarily work, right? And it can just lead to very polarized conversations where actually maybe you both really care about the same things.
I'll jump in there and I'll say, I think in terms of negative pushback, and then Lindsay's got another really good question, but in terms of negative pushback or people being argumentative with our vision, a lot of times I find that people that haven't delved below like having seen the name of the organization and think that we're trying to put a happy face on very serious problems, or trying to say that everything is all right or going to be all right, or that there's some kind of easy pat solution, Pollyanna kind of mess. I'm trying not to swear. But I think that one of the best things that we can do is engage with people, and you know, it's already been covered. A lot of people want to engage but feel disempowered or feel frustrated. But actually get people to start talking about why they have a visceral negative reaction to the words optimism and conservation in the same sentence. And then usually once you start talking to someone and you start saying, you know, well, are you still doing anything for conservation? Like, do you still think it's important for us to act? And then talking about, you know, and if they say yes, say, you know, and do you think it's important to try to motivate people and get people involved and connect people with the action steps? Most people come around very quickly. I've found very few people that go, no, I really believe in conservation pessimism, by the time we start explaining what it is we actually do. So maybe we should jump in. And
no, we're not jumping in. Sorry, we run out of time. The last question. Yeah, sorry. So what we're going to do is, I think we should be able to still use the chat to answer. I think there's been two or three more questions that have been put on there. So we'll make sure to get back on to you on the chat, but we have to like wrap up the session, so we can't take any more questions. But thank you all so much for being on the panel, and thank you all for listening to us. I hope you enjoyed the session.